Ethan Blackwood had everything: money, power, and a name that made the world tremble. But one night, a mysterious beggar woman gave him advice that would change his life forever. What started as a simple encounter unraveled secrets, love, and a betrayal so shocking that the world gasped. Was he ready for the truth? A stormy night in New York. New York City was drowning in a relentless storm. The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom as it glided through the nearly empty streets. Streetlights flickered, their golden glow distorted by the water running down the pavement, creating ghostly reflections in the night. Inside the luxury car, Ethan Blackwood sat in the back seat, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the bright screen of his phone. A faint crease formed between his brows as he scrolled through an email. Another billion-dollar acquisition successfully sealed. His financial advisors were ecstatic. For most people, owning the world was a dream. For Ethan, it was just another day. Tall, dark-haired, and devastatingly handsome, Ethan wasn't just any billionaire. He was a ruthless empire builder. A man who turned failing companies into gold and crushed competitors without a second thought. People feared him, respected him, envied him, but no one truly knew him. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The rhythmic clicking of the turn signal barely registered in his mind as the car slowed to a stop at a red light. He barely glanced up until something unusual caught his eye. Through the rain-streaked window, he noticed an elderly woman standing alone under a flickering street lamp. She was dressed in rags, her frail body shivering beneath a tattered coat. Her silver hair clung to her face, wet and tangled from the storm. But it wasn't her condition that unsettled him. It was her eyes, dark, piercing, filled with an unnerving wisdom. Not the eyes of someone broken by the world, but of someone who had seen too much, lived too much, and understood something he didn't. Ethan didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. The moment that changed everything. The light remained red. His driver, accustomed to his boss's strict schedule, instinctively reached for the gas pedal, but wait. The word left Ethan's lips before he even realized he had spoken. The driver stopped immediately. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before rolling down the tinted window, allowing the cold night air and the scent of wet pavement to seep into the car. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, stopping just at the curb, her gaze never leaving his. "Son, you look lost." Her voice was soft, but it carried weight, an undeniable strength. A knowingness that sent an unfamiliar sensation curling in his chest. Ethan's brows furrowed, his grip tightened around his phone. "Lost?" he echoed, amusement lacing his voice, though his lips barely twitched. "I think you're mistaken, Mom. I know exactly where I'm going." The woman smiled, not in mockery, not in pity, but in a way that suggested she knew something he didn't. "No, son. You only know where your money is going, not where your heart should be." The words struck like lightning for a man who had spent his entire life believing that power, control, and wealth were the only things that mattered. Ethan should have laughed, but for some reason, he didn't. A strange silence stretched between them. The rain pattered against the roof of his car, loud and rhythmic, as if marking the moment itself. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a scoff. "And you would know that." "How?" The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him. And then she said something that made the world tilt beneath him. "Because I used to be you." A glimpse into the past. Something flickered in her eyes. Pain. Not the kind that comes from poverty, but the kind that comes from loss. Ethan had spent years perfecting the art of emotionless indifference, yet for the first time in a long time, his carefully constructed walls wavered, his jaw clenched. "If you're looking for money, you're wasting your time." But the woman shook her head. "I don't need your money, son. I just hope that one day you'll understand the things you chase now, they won't fill the emptiness inside you. Ethan stiffened, his heart slammed against his ribs. How the hell did she know that? His entire life had been built on distraction, deals, numbers, and fleeting encounters with beautiful women who only wanted his wealth. If he was empty, he never let himself feel it. And yet, in the eyes of a woman who had nothing, he felt completely exposed. The light turned green. Walking away from destiny. Ethan forced a chuckle, his walls snapping back into place. "You must be a fortune teller," he muttered, rolling his window up. "Good luck with that." The car pulled away, but as he glanced in the side mirror one last time, she was still standing there, unmoving, watching, as if she had just seen into his soul, as if she knew the kind of man he was going to become. And for the first time in his life, Ethan felt something he couldn't explain, something like regret, sleepless nights, and the haunting words. That night, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years closing billion-dollar deals, attending high-society events, living in a world where power dictated everything. So why? Why did a single conversation with a beggar woman unsettle him this much? "Then why do you look so empty?" The words echoed in his mind, over and over. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. It didn't matter. She was just some old woman, a stranger with nothing better to do. And yet, the words wouldn't leave him. Somewhere in the city she was still out there, a woman who had nothing, yet somehow knew more about him than he wanted to admit. Ethan closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, all he saw was the look in her eyes, the one that whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face, and something told him that this was only the beginning. Sleepless nights and unwanted thoughts. Ethan Blackwood had never believed in fate. To him, life was simple. Either you had power or you were nothing. But that night, as he lay on his king-sized bed in his luxury penthouse, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Unease. His bedroom was a masterpiece of modern design, floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking Manhattan, crisp white sheets, dim golden lighting, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Yet, despite all the wealth, he felt empty. "Then why do you look so empty?" The beggar woman's words echoed in his mind. Why did he care? She was just another nobody, another speck in the city's endless sea of desperate people. He had everything. He had won. So why did it feel like he had lost? He sat up, ran a hand through his dark, tousled hair, and exhaled. The whiskey on his nightstand tempted him, but for the first time he didn't reach for it. Instead, he walked to the giant window, his reflection staring back at him. A man with perfectly sculpted features, piercing blue eyes, a billionaire in every sense. But behind the expensive suit, he barely recognized himself. The cracks began to show. The next morning, Ethan buried himself in work, meetings, contracts, negotiations, the usual things that kept him distracted. But no matter how much he tried to drown himself in numbers and deals, her words clung to him like a shadow. "Sir, are you okay?" His assistant, Michael, looked at him curiously during a board meeting. Ethan realized his mind had wandered again, his jaw clenched. "I'm fine. Let's move on." But he wasn't fine. The truth was, for the first time in years, he felt disconnected from his own life. That night, instead of heading home, he told his driver to take a detour. "Where to, sir?" Ethan hesitated, then muttered, "The same place as last night." The driver said nothing, but the flicker of surprise in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. Searching for the beggar woman. The rain had stopped, but the streets still smelled of damp asphalt and old city secrets. Ethan stepped out of his car, his handmade Italian shoes touching the pavement that had been soaked in countless stories of struggle. But the old woman was gone. He looked around, frustration creeping in. Why did he even care? What did he expect? That she would be waiting for him, ready to give him another cryptic life lesson. He sighed and turned to leave. Looking for someone? Ethan froze. The voice belonged to a woman, but not the one he expected. She stood a few feet away, holding a crate of supplies in her arms. Sophie Turner. And just like that, his world shifted again. Enter Sophie, the woman who would change everything. Sophie wasn't like the women Ethan was used to. She wasn't draped in designer clothes or dripping with jewels. She was different. Dressed in a simple coat, her dark auburn hair tied in a loose ponytail, her hazel eyes filled with warmth, she carried herself with a quiet confidence. She was beautiful, but not in the way the supermodels and gold diggers around him were. She was real. Ethan's gaze flickered to the crate in her arms. She was helping the homeless. "You don't belong here," he said before he could stop himself. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And you do?" Ethan stiffened. No one talked to him like that, no one dared. "I was looking for someone," he muttered, ignoring the way her gaze made him feel strangely exposed. "The old woman?" Sophie tilted her head. "Eleanor?" His heart kicked. "You know her?" Sophie sighed, setting the crate down. "Everyone around here knows Eleanor. She's been on these streets for years. But she disappears for days sometimes. No one knows where she goes." Ethan frowned. "Disappears?" "She's special, you know," Sophie added, watching him carefully. "She doesn't beg for herself. She gives whatever she gets to others. And she always seems to know exactly what people need to hear." Ethan looked away. "She thinks I need to hear that I'm empty." Sophie studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Are you?" He didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know. A dangerous attraction. There was something about Sophie that unsettled him. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him feel different. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She wasn't intimidated by his presence. She wasn't like the people who fawned over him at business events, hoping to get close to his money. And somehow that made him want to know more about her. "Why are you helping these people?" he asked, genuinely curious. Sophie's gaze softened. "Because someone has to." Her words were simple, but they hit something deep inside him. Ethan had spent his life building an empire, crushing competitors and securing his place at the top. But in doing so, had he forgotten how to be human? He didn't realize how long he had been staring at her until Sophie smirked. "Something on your mind, billionaire?" Ethan chuckled, the sound foreign even to his own ears. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" Sophie crossed her arms. "Should I be?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Most people are." She didn't flinch. Instead, she held his gaze, her hazel eyes burning with quiet fire. "Maybe that's the problem." Ethan felt something stir inside him, something dangerous. Attraction. Real, raw attraction. Not the kind he was used to, the fleeting, meaningless kind that ended in expensive hotel rooms and forgettable goodbyes. No, this was different, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The first step toward change. As Ethan walked away that night, Sophie's voice and Eleanor's words clashed in his mind. "Then why do you look so empty?" Maybe that's the problem. For the first time, Ethan wasn't thinking about money, power, or deals. He was thinking about something else entirely. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Restless thoughts and unshakable feelings. Ethan Blackwood wasn't used to feeling uncertain. His life had always been built on precision, every move calculated, every decision measured. But now his thoughts were a mess. He sat in his penthouse office, towering above New York City, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. The screen in front of him displayed a multi-million-dollar merger proposal, but he wasn't seeing the numbers. He was seeing her, Sophie. The way her hazel eyes had dared to challenge him. The way she spoke with such conviction and kindness. The way she didn't care about his money, his power, or his name. She was different, and that terrified him. Ethan exhaled sharply and shut his laptop. What was happening to him? He didn't have time for distractions. And yet, he grabbed his coat, his mind already made up. He had to see her again. Their paths cross, again. The streets were quieter tonight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the city's late-night stories. Ethan's Rolls-Royce pulled up to the same corner where he had first met the beggar woman. He stepped out, his heart thudding for reasons he refused to acknowledge. And then he saw her. Sophie. She was kneeling beside a homeless man, wrapping a blanket around his frail shoulders. Her fingers moved with care, her face filled with warmth as she murmured soft reassurances. Ethan had spent his whole life watching people pretend to care. But this was real. She looked up, noticing him. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, then amusement. Well, the billionaire returns, Ethan smirked. Disappointed? Sophie stood, brushing her hands against her jeans. A little. I thought you were too busy conquering the world. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Maybe I needed a break. Sophie folded her arms, studying him with that same unreadable expression that made him feel exposed. And what exactly do you need a break from? Your fancy penthouse? Your millions of dollars? Ethan should have been annoyed, but instead he found himself intrigued. No one spoke to him like this. No one dared to push him like she did. He held her gaze. Maybe I needed a break from myself. For the first time, Sophie's teasing smile faltered slightly. There was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, something she understood, but she masked it quickly. And you thought you'd come back here? Ethan shrugged, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. Maybe I wanted to see you. The moment the words left his mouth, he realized how true they were. Sophie blinked, and for the first time she looked caught off guard. But she recovered quickly, shaking her head with a soft laugh. Flattery doesn't work on me, billionaire. Ethan smirked. Good. I don't do flattery. Their eyes locked, and for a brief electric moment, the world around them faded. The honking cars, the city lights, the noise. It was just them. Ethan had spent his whole life chasing things that never filled the void inside him. But standing here, looking into Sophie's defiant, beautiful eyes, he felt something he hadn't in a long, long time. Real. A moment of vulnerability. Sophie glanced at the watch on her wrist. I have to go. My shift starts soon. Ethan frowned. Shift? She raised an eyebrow. You think I just wander the streets all night? Ethan hesitated. He had assumed she was just some kind-hearted volunteer. But now? Where do you work? Sophie sighed. A small diner. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Ethan stared at her. She worked a regular job. For some reason, that made her even more fascinating. Let me take you there, he said before he could stop himself. Sophie laughed. You? In a diner? Wearing a suit that probably costs more than my yearly rent? Ethan smirked. I can be full of surprises. She studied him, biting her lip as if debating whether to say yes. Then, with a playful shrug, she said, All right, billionaire. Let's see if you can survive a normal person's world. A night at the diner. The billionaire, out of his element. The small diner was nothing like the places Ethan usually frequented. It was warm, simple, and filled with life. The scent of coffee and fresh pancakes lingered in the air. Sophie tied her apron around her waist and grabbed a notepad. All right, Mr. Billionaire, take a seat. I've got customers to serve. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head as he slid into a booth. Why was this woman so damn captivating? He watched as she moved around the diner, taking orders, laughing with customers, and even scolding a teenager who was trying to sneak an extra cookie. She was so full of life, so effortlessly herself. When she finally came back to his table, she smirked. So, how's the view? Ethan leaned forward, his blue eyes locked onto hers. Breathtaking. For a second, Sophie actually looked flustered. She quickly cleared her throat. Smooth, billionaire. Real smooth. But Ethan saw the way her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up his empty coffee cup. He saw the way her cheeks flushed just a little. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something he couldn't ignore. He wanted more. More of this feeling, more of her. And he had a sinking feeling that he was falling for Sophie Turner. Ethan's restlessness, a hunger he can't understand. For days, Ethan Blackwood tried to focus on his empire. The billion-dollar deals, the stock market fluctuations, the board meetings, it was all routine. Yet something was off. His thoughts weren't in his office. They were in a small diner. With her. Sophie Turner had intruded into his world without even trying. He could still hear her laughter, see the fire in her eyes, feel the way her presence tore down something inside him. He had never chased after a woman before. Women chased him. They threw themselves at him for his money, his name, his power. But Sophie? She treated him like he was just a man, and that made him want her even more. A dinner invitation, and a woman who says no. Unable to ignore the pull anymore, Ethan did something he never did. He texted first. Ethan, dinner, tonight, 8 p.m. Let me take you somewhere nice. Minutes passed, no reply. Then, Sophie, a billionaire used a full stop in a text. Sounds serious. Ethan smirked. He could almost hear her teasing tone. Ethan, I'll pick you up. Another pause. Then, Sophie, I work tonight. You know, real people jobs. Ethan frowned. Rejected? No one rejected him. Ever. But instead of frustration, he felt something dangerous. Excitement. Ethan. Call in sick. Sophie. Not all of us can throw money at our problems, billionaire. Ethan laughed. He hadn't laughed like that in years. Ethan. Then let me experience your world again. I'll come to the diner. This time the pause was longer. Much longer. Then, Sophie. Fine. But no suits. You wear one, and I'll make you wash dishes. Ethan. Deal. A night like no other. The billionaire and the waitress. Ethan arrived without a chauffeur, without a suit, without his usual arrogant presence. Just jeans and a black shirt. Simple but devastatingly attractive. When Sophie saw him walk through the diner doors, she froze. He looked different. Less like a billionaire. More like a man she could actually fall for. Not that she was falling. Not at all. She cleared her throat, refusing to let her heartbeat betray her. Impressive. You don't look like a corporate robot anymore. Ethan smirked, leaning against the counter. And you don't look as terrifying as usual. Sophie rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched into a smile. What's your order, billionaire? Ethan met her gaze, his voice smooth. Surprise me. For the first time that night, Sophie hesitated. Because Ethan Blackwood was no longer just a rich man playing games. Something had shifted, and she was scared of what it meant. A dance in the moonlight. Sparks fly. The night ended differently. Sophie had finished her shift, exhausted but strangely content. Ethan had stayed the entire time, watching her, teasing her, making her feel things she had no business feeling. As they stepped out of the diner, the city glowed around them. Sophie sighed. All right, billionaire. You survived another night in the real world. What now? Ethan smirked. Now? You owe me a dance. She blinked. Excuse me? Ethan stepped closer. I don't ask twice, Sophie. Sophie narrowed her eyes. And I don't dance. Ethan took her hand anyway. She should have pulled away. She should have resisted. But the second his fingers laced with hers, the world tilted. The city's chaos faded. The neon lights softened. And suddenly, it was just them. He pulled her close, closer than she should have allowed. His breath was warm against her skin. You're not running away this time. Her heart pounded. Who says I'm staying? His lips curved. Because you want to know what this feels like just as much as I do. Sophie opened her mouth, to argue, to deny, to say anything. But then he moved, slow, effortless steps, guiding her, teasing her, and before she knew it, she was dancing, under the city lights, against his chest, with her heart racing in ways she couldn't understand. Ethan's fingers brushed her waist, lingering just long enough to send shivers down her spine. You're beautiful, he murmured, almost like a secret. Sophie swallowed hard. Ethan. His grip tightened slightly. Say my name again. Her lips parted. She almost did. But then she remembered who he was, who she was, and the walls came crashing back up. She stepped back, breaking the moment. Whatever this is, it's a bad idea. Ethan's jaw clenched. Why? Sophie's voice wavered. Because I don't belong in your world. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood felt something he didn't know how to fight. Fear. Because for the first time, he had something to lose. And it was her. Ethan's struggle. The heart versus the mind. Ethan Blackwood had conquered the world. Boardrooms feared him. Rivals envied him. Women desired him. Yet here he was, sitting alone in his penthouse, staring at his whiskey glass, thinking about a waitress who didn't want him. Sophie Turner had done something no one had ever done before. She had walked away. The dance they shared had been more than just a moment. It had been a warning that she could destroy him, that he could fall. And Ethan had never been the type to lose control. But control was slipping, fast. And for the first time, he didn't want to stop it. Sophie's battle, a heart she can't trust. Sophie sat in her tiny apartment, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at the city lights through the cracked window. Her heart was still racing from the way Ethan had held her, the way his voice had wrapped around her name, the way he had looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. And that terrified her, because Sophie knew men like him. Rich, powerful, untouchable. They didn't fall in love. They got bored. And she refused to be someone's temporary distraction. Her heart had been broken once before, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. But why, then, did she feel so hollow walking away? Ethan won't accept defeat. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't letting her go. If she thought she could shut him out, she was wrong. So he did something that shocked everyone. He left his empire for a day. No calls, no meetings, no billion-dollar deals. Just him and one mission: to win Sophie Turner. A grand gesture, number A grand challenge. Sophie was wiping down the diner counter when he walked in, dressed casually again, looking impossibly handsome and confident, and making her heart stumble in ways she despised. She crossed her arms. You again? Ethan smirked. Surprised? Disappointed, she shot back, though the flutter in her stomach betrayed her. Ethan slid onto a stool. I don't give up, Sophie, she sighed, shaking her head. What do you want? Ethan leaned forward, his gaze locked onto hers. You. Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. She scoffed. You don't even know me. Ethan's smirk softened. Then let me. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Why? Because I rejected you? His voice was lower now, serious. Because you make me feel something real. She wasn't expecting that. Not from a man like him. And for the first time, she didn't know what to say. A deal. Neither can resist. Sophie needed to regain control. So she did what she always did. She challenged him. You want to know me, billionaire? She leaned on the counter. Fine, prove it. Ethan arched an eyebrow. How? She smirked. Spend a whole day in my world. No cars, no assistants, no private jets, just you and a normal life. Ethan chuckled. You think I can't survive a day without luxury? Sophie grinned. I think you'll beg to leave by noon. Ethan's blue eyes gleamed with something dangerous. You're on, sweetheart. And just like that, the game had changed. A billionaire's day in the real world. Sparks fly. From the moment Ethan stepped into Sophie's reality, things started falling apart. 1. Morning struggles. Ethan was forced to wake up early. No breakfast in bed, no 5-star meals. Instead, a burnt piece of toast and instant coffee. He grimaced. This is inhumane, Sophie smirked. Welcome to my life. 2. Public transport. Nightmare. Ethan, a man used to private jets and luxury cars, was shoved into a crowded subway, elbowed by strangers, and nearly robbed by a pickpocket. Sophie tried not to laugh. Still having fun? Ethan glared. I'd rather be hit by a truck. 3. Working a shift together. Sophie made Ethan wait tables. He spilled coffee on a customer. He got yelled at by an old lady for bringing the wrong order. And, by lunchtime, he was exhausted. Admit it, Sophie teased. You're dying inside. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, grinning. Not yet, but ask me in an hour. And for the first time they laughed together. Really laughed, and Sophie felt herself slipping. A night. Neither will forget. By the end of the day, Ethan was tired, hungry, and covered in stains from a milkshake accident. But he was also the happiest he had been in years. Sophie sat beside him on a park bench, the city lights twinkling above them. She sighed. I have to admit, you lasted longer than I thought, Ethan smirked. Told you, I don't give up. She shook her head. I still don't get it. Ethan turned to her, his voice quiet. Get what? She hesitated. Why you're here? Why you're doing this? His jaw clenched. Then, after a moment, because I don't want to be that man anymore. Sophie blinked. What man? Ethan exhaled. The man who never feels anything real. The man who hides behind money and power because it's easier than being vulnerable. Her heart pounded. He was serious, and that scared her more than anything, because if this was real, she would fall, and she didn't know if she could survive another heartbreak. So she did the only thing she could. She pushed him away. You don't belong here, Ethan. His jaw tightened. Maybe I don't, but I belong with you. Sophie's breath hitched, but before she could answer, Ethan leaned in, his lips hovered inches from hers. And she knew. If he kissed her, she was done. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She stood up. I can't, she whispered. Ethan's eyes darkened with something painful. Why? Sophie swallowed hard. Because you'll leave, and I don't want to be left again. Ethan's expression shattered, because for the first time, he realized, she wasn't rejecting him, she was protecting herself. And Ethan Blackwood, a man who had never fought for anyone before, made a silent vow. He wasn't going anywhere. And he would prove it, no matter what it took. Ethan's restlessness, a man who can't let go. Ethan Blackwood had never been ignored before, yet Sophie had walked away from him, not once but twice. And it was driving him insane. She was under his skin, in his thoughts, his dreams, his every breath. He had built an empire, turned his name into power, but none of it had ever shaken him like this, like her. Because when Sophie left him standing in that park, something inside him had snapped. For the first time, he was afraid. Afraid that no matter how much he fought for her, he would never be enough. But Ethan Blackwood didn't give up. Not on business, not on challenges, and definitely not on her. So he made a decision. He would break down every wall she built, until there was nowhere left to run. Sophie's fear, the ghosts of her past. Sophie wasn't sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. Ethan's voice, his touch, the way his lips had hovered just inches from hers, waiting for her to surrender. But she couldn't, because love wasn't a fairy tale. Love had ruined her once before, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. She had trusted a man before, and he had shattered her, left her broken, left her alone. And men like Ethan, they always left, so she did what she had to. She buried her feelings. She ignored the ache in her chest, and she told herself that what she felt for Ethan wasn't real, even though, deep down, she knew. She was lying to herself. Ethan's grand gesture, a date she can't resist. Ethan knew he had to do something big, something that would make Sophie see him differently. So he walked into the diner one evening, looking effortlessly handsome, and made her an offer she couldn't refuse. "One date," he said, sliding a single red rose across the counter. Sophie arched a brow. "You don't give up, do you?" Ethan smirked. "Not when it comes to something I want," she sighed. "Ethan." "No expectations," he interrupted. "No promises. Just one night where we pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist." Her heart pounded. One night. One night wouldn't hurt, right? Sophie hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, she said yes. The most unforgettable night of their lives. Ethan didn't take her to a five-star restaurant, didn't pull up in a limousine. Instead, he took her to the beach. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, waves crashing gently against the shore. A blanket was spread out on the sand with simple but thoughtful food. Wine, fresh strawberries, a homemade pasta dish Ethan had cooked himself. Sophie stared at him in shock. "You cooked?" Ethan grinned. "I had a little help." But yes, she sat down, smiling despite herself. For the first time, she saw a different side of him. Not the billionaire, not the powerful CEO, just a man trying to win her heart. And it scared her, because it was working. Under the stars. A love that can't be denied. They ate. They laughed. They talked. For hours, they sat under the stars, sharing things they had never told anyone. Ethan spoke about his lonely childhood, about how money had never made him feel worthy. Sophie told him about her past heartbreak, about how she had trusted someone once and he had destroyed her. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Who was he?" he asked, voice dark with dangerous protectiveness. Sophie shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But Ethan's fingers brushed against hers, sending shivers down her spine. "It matters to me," he murmured. Sophie's heart ached, because in that moment she knew. Ethan Blackwood wasn't like the man who had hurt her. He was something else entirely, something real, and it terrified her. The kiss that changed everything. The night had grown colder, and Ethan wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. Sophie shivered, not from the cold, but from his touch. She turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan's gaze burned into hers. "Because you're the first thing in my life that feels real," he said softly. Sophie's breath caught. The world disappeared. And before she could stop herself, she leaned in. Just a little, just enough. And that was all it took. Ethan closed the distance, his lips brushing against hers, hesitant, waiting. A silent question, a test of control. And then Sophie broke. She kissed him back. It wasn't soft, it wasn't slow. It was fire, electricity. A storm neither of them could stop. Ethan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss, as if he would never let her go. And Sophie let him. For the first time, she let herself fall. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not fear, not the past, not the world, just them, together. A love that's just beginning. But trouble looms. As the night faded and reality returned, Sophie felt a new kind of fear. Because what if this wasn't just a kiss? What if this was the start of something she couldn't stop? And what if she let herself love him, only to have him leave? Meanwhile, Ethan had no idea that his past was about to catch up with him. A scandal, a secret, a betrayal that could ruin everything. And Sophie was about to find out the real reason Ethan Blackwood was chasing after love. Would she still love him when the truth came out? Or would this kiss be their first and last? A morning of hope and an unexpected storm. Sophie woke up feeling something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The warmth of the morning sun streamed through her tiny apartment window, and for once her heart wasn't heavy. For the first time in so long, she felt wanted, cherished, alive. She could still feel Ethan's touch lingering on her skin, still hear his deep voice whispering her name under the stars. Was this real? Could she, a woman who had been broken so many times, actually have this happiness? As she ran her fingers over her lips, still swollen from his kisses, she dared to hope. But fate wasn't so kind, because as soon as she checked her phone, her entire world came crashing down. Headlines flashed across the screen. Ethan Blackwood's secret deal, love or betrayal. Billionaire plays with a waitress' heart. But why? Sophie's hands trembled as she read the article, and with every word the pain in her chest grew sharper. The secret that destroyed her trust. Ethan Blackwood's name was everywhere. According to the reports, his interest in her wasn't as innocent as she had believed. A leaked contract, a multi-million-dollar business merger, a hidden connection to the very man who had once destroyed Sophie's life. And worst of all, Ethan had known about her past, before he ever met her, before he ever claimed to love her. He had kept the truth from her all along. Sophie's heart shattered. Was she just a game to him? Was this just another deal for the billionaire who could have anything he wanted? Had she been a fool to believe in him? Tears blurred her vision as she grabbed her coat. She needed answers. But more than that, she needed to walk away before she lost herself again. Ethan's desperate search. A man on the edge. Ethan had never felt panic before, not in business, not in life. But when Sophie's number kept going straight to voicemail, his world tilted. He knew she had seen the news. He could feel it in his gut. And if he didn't stop her now, he might lose her forever. Without a second thought, he jumped into his car and raced to her apartment. The streets blurred past him, his hands gripping the wheel as if his life depended on it. Because it did. She was his life now, and he wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers. A heart-wrenching confrontation. The breaking point. When Ethan reached Sophie's apartment, she was already waiting. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. But her eyes were filled with betrayal, the same betrayal that haunted him in his nightmares. Ethan's chest tightened. "Sophie, let me explain. Did you know?" Her voice was quiet. Too quiet. He took a step closer. "Sophie, please, it's not what you think." "Did you know?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Ethan's throat went dry. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say, because he had known. Not everything, not the full extent, but he had known enough. And the moment Sophie saw the truth in his eyes, she took a step back. That one step felt like 1,000 miles, and Ethan felt helpless. Sophie let out a shaky breath. "I trusted you." Ethan swallowed hard. "Sophie, please don't walk away from this. From us." She gave him a broken smile. "There was never an us, Ethan." And with that, she walked away, leaving Ethan standing there powerless for the first time in his life. A love worth fighting for. Ethan's next move. Ethan Blackwood had been many things in his life. A billionaire, a strategist, a man who never let his emotions control him. But right now, he was just a man who had lost the woman he loved. And he wasn't going to let that happen. Not now, not ever. Because Sophie had given up on love. But Ethan was about to prove to her that real love never gives up. Ethan's breaking point. A man who won't let go. Ethan Blackwood had never begged before, never chased, never pleaded, never needed anyone. Until Sophie. And now he was losing her. The cold emptiness in her eyes when she walked away haunted him. The sound of her voice, cracking under the weight of betrayal, echoed in his mind like a punishment he deserved. His entire world, his entire soul, had walked out of his life. And he couldn't let that happen. Sophie was his home, and without her he was nothing. So he made a choice. He was going to fight for her, no matter what it took. No matter how impossible it seemed, because real love never gave up. And he wasn't about to lose the only thing in his life that ever truly mattered. Sophie's walls. A heart too broken to trust. Again, Sophie told herself it was over. She packed up her emotions, locked them away, and buried them deep inside her heart. Ethan Blackwood was just another name in her past. Just another mistake she refused to make again. But no matter how hard she tried to forget, his voice still lingered, his touch still burned, and her heart still ached for him. She wouldn't be that girl again. She wouldn't let herself believe in fairy tales, because fairy tales weren't real. Love wasn't real. And Ethan Blackwood? He was the last man on earth she could ever trust. So why did it hurt so much when she thought about never seeing him again? Why did her chest tighten every time she remembered the way he had looked at her that night? Like she was the only thing in his world. Like she was everything. Ethan's grand gesture, the billionaire's public confession. Ethan knew words wouldn't be enough. Not for a woman like Sophie, not after what he had done. So he did the only thing he could. He put everything on the line. He called the press. He called his investors. And he made a statement the whole world would see. Standing at a grand press conference in front of cameras and reporters, he exposed his heart. This isn't about money. This isn't about business. This is about her. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but his heart racing. I fell in love with Sophie Winters the moment I met her. Gasps, murmurs, flashing lights. Ethan didn't care, he kept going. She changed my life. She made me see the world differently. She made me feel. The cameras zoomed in. The world was watching and Ethan didn't care, because the only person he wanted to reach was her. I hurt her. I broke her trust, and I would do anything to fix that. His voice dropped, but the emotion in it shook the room. Sophie, if you're watching this, I love you. The room fell silent. The world held its breath. But all Ethan cared about was whether Sophie still loved him too. Sophie's reaction, a heart that refuses to let go. Sophie stood frozen in front of her television screen. Tears streamed down her face. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't a calculated move. This was real. Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire who never let himself be vulnerable, had just bared his soul to the entire world. For her. And in that moment she knew the truth. She had never stopped loving him. She had just been too afraid to believe in love. But Ethan had just proved that real love never gives up. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to give up either. A reunion filled with fire, love, and tears. Ethan stood in the rain, staring at Sophie's apartment door. He didn't know if she would come back, didn't know if she would forgive him, but he had to try. And then, the door opened. Sophie stood there, her eyes filled with every emotion in the world: anger, hope, fear, love. Ethan's breath caught. Sophie. She stepped forward, and before he could finish his sentence, she kissed him, not softly, not hesitantly, but with fire, passion, desperation. She poured every ounce of heartbreak, love, and longing into that kiss. And Ethan gave it all back. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, vowing to never let go. Not again. Never again. A love that was meant to be. Sophie pulled away, her forehead resting against his. Promise me, she whispered. Ethan cupped her face, his voice raw with emotion. I swear to you, Sophie, I will never hurt you again. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time she believed him. Love wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy. But with Ethan, it was worth it. And as he kissed her again, the past faded away. Because this was their story, and it was just beginning.